My name's Max Gagliardi, and this is the Talk Energy podcast. If you're watching this video, take a moment, hit the subscribe button on YouTube, or you can follow me on your favorite podcast app. This episode's guest is David Heikkinen, the CEO and founder of Heikkinen Energy Advisors. This episode's also special because David's announcing the merger of his firm with Pickering Energy Partners, where David will take on the role of managing partner at the newly combined firm. You may have also noticed that David and I have started a new weekly podcast called Talk Energy Insights. We go into a bunch of different topics and you can hear us riff on a weekly basis. If you haven't checked it out, you should check it out. It's good stuff. This episode was filmed about a month ago, so we may have covered some of this stuff in the Talk Energy Insights episodes, but I think most of it is fresh, and we had to wait to release it till the announcement came out about his merger. This episode's filled with discussions about a variety of different energy topics. We covered David's career and what led him to be an entrepreneur. We talk about the current state of the oil and gas industry and how things have trended. And lastly, we cover David's views on the energy transition and why he thinks right now is the most exciting time to work in the energy industry. Hope you enjoy the show.
It's good to meet you first.
Yeah, well, let me do the intro. So, Heik, welcome to Talk Energy. Thanks for making the trip to the studio. Haven't done a ton of these in person, but it's fun to get you here. We've been texting about it for a little while, and I'm glad that you were able to make it happen.
Yeah, I appreciate the invitation, and I listen to a lot of podcasts and I listen to yours, and I like the way you do things. You got a good voice and a good vibe, so happy to be here. Just my background, and very quickly to introduce what I've been doing and what I've been thinking about. So I grew up in mid-Missouri, went to engineering school at Missouri Science and Technology, got into the oil business in 1992, and essentially was one of two people that Shell hired into New Orleans out of the entire organization, and just dropped into this great training ground of people that had survived the crash of the 80s and just wanted to teach me stuff. Was there for about 8 years. Got an MBA at Tulane while I was there, and then found this opportunity to become an equity research analyst.
What were you doing a lot while you were there?
I did originally facilities engineering, a little bit of production engineering, then went into subsea projects. And I was in New Orleans that whole time. And really what got me out of Shell was they moved the subsea group, which was essentially like the equivalent of the space program of putting things into ultra deep water on the ocean floor. Yeah. Super cool technology, like ton of opportunity. They moved my group to Houston, and at that point my wife was in medical school in New Orleans, and I also never wanted to move to Houston. And so I got put on a separate project, and then got the opportunity to join this little firm, South Coast Capital, as an equity analyst. And man, that was March of 2000, and I think the S&P weighting of energy was about as low as it ever had been. Yeah. And I just caught the waves. And
that was a good decade, though, to be in energy.
No, it's
rising commodity prices is always nice.
I actually think that life's a lot about those inflection points where you find something and you do something different. I know listening to your podcast about how you started up and leaving Chesapeake and trying to do a little soul searching about figuring out what you want to do. But it is definitely those things happen, and taking as much risk as you possibly can at your earliest age is something that I advise everybody to do. And I took a job for a little less than half of what I'd made the previous year at Shell.
Yeah. Wow.
Had no idea what a sell side analyst was, and just got this opportunity of trying to figure out how you could explore in the Gulf of Mexico, and like you said, caught that wave. And then nobody knew, found ultra petroleum, tight gas emerged, cross timbers became XTO, EOG came out, you had the Barnett emerge, you had shale gas basically get the first stage of technology really being deployed. And then you really had the oil shale revolution, which, was the second wave that I caught.
When did you know or start to get feelings that the rumblings of all this was happening, like as you saw? And I've read some of the books about, because that was like right before my career. It's kind of I was still like around college or just getting into college around that time. So when did you start to realize, hey, this is more than just maybe some niche thing that some guy in one basin was able to unlock some additional reserves, to where it was like, wow, we're really moving into a new era? Did that hit it once, or was it a gradual?
Yeah, there's actually a legacy origin story of we were covering a company, so like Cross Timbers, that was XTO, that Exxon then bought for $42 billion, was $150 million market cap, I think, when we picked it up. And we found a company, Southwestern Energy, that was exploring in South Louisiana and had some East Texas assets kind of near where XTO was.
Right.
They had just had a lawsuit against them and like had a $300 million lawsuit against them, and kind of had one of those look each other in the eye moment of like, are we going to make this work or not?
Yeah.
And so we were pretty big proponents of tight gas. You know, you'd had the revolution of the power industry that was consuming gas, moving away from coal. It was a transition fuel, and there's all sorts of an ability to basically put kind of an industrial logic of manufacturing into drilling downspacing from 40 acres to 20 to 10s in the Rockies and in Texas. And so we were marketing with, so one of the things that sell side analysts do is we take companies on the road and introduce them to investors. And I was on the West Coast in San Francisco with Harold Carell, the CEO of Southwestern. And we got in a car to go to our next meeting. And he made a comment. He's like, I think we found something that's bigger than anything I've ever seen in my career. And he'd been at Tenneco and like huge offshore discovery, like major company, had seen a lot. And you know, those are the types of comments that you kind of put in your mental Rolodex and say, this matters.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like a comment in front of investors or anybody. And so we went out and searched for every place that they had ever permitted. And then soon after, they unveiled the Fayetteville Shale.
Sure.
And you know, really, Range did the same thing in the Marcellus. You know, Mark Whitley had gone from Mitchell to Range, and really, you know, Jeff Ventura and that team really did. You know, Ray Walker unlocked that basin, and they get huge credit for that. But you know, whenever we saw the shale gas emerge, it really did take off with really seeing the Barnett being extended into really the Fayetteville and the Marcellus. And it was an interesting time because it was the first time that all of these oil and gas folks like us that were, you know, traditionally starved for an idea, like you didn't know what you're going to do at the end of the year in the Gulf of Mexico. Like you're always trying to find a wedge of production to make your operating plan, and you know, looking for recompletions, looking for other opportunities, fields, and now you had this opportunity where you knew exactly what you were going to find, and you could just do it again and again and again. That really just then led to almost like you gave crack to a bunch of capital addicts was the beginning, and really 06 was probably the peak for return on capital employed for the group as a whole, and you could argue is the peak for the cycle. And then EOG really, and Continental and the Williston, you know, took horizontal development, you know, really into the Bakken and then the Eagle Ford, and then that really changed the game completely. But it's funny because I picked up Pioneer. So I in 2005 I joined a firm, Pickering Energy Partners, with Dan Pickering. Now he's Pickering Energy Partners again. And then that met this guy, Bobby Tudor, at breakfast at the St. Regis, and realized that something important was going to happen, which is the reason I moved from New Orleans to Houston, because we became Tudor Pickering, and then we recruited Maynard Holt, became Tudor Pickering Holt, and was there from really 2005 until 2012 when I retired from the business. I legitimately retired. I had no idea what I was going to do next. My kids I have 2 boys and a girl, essentially triplets. They were going to go into kindergarten that fall, and it was February of 2012. And I saw this window of having an opportunity just to do something different. And I spent a lot of time with them and got super active. And, you know, dads in a PTO, one thing that you'll learn is you're effectively Superman if you show up as a man. And like I was doing less than most of the moms and women that were running the organization.
That's funny. My wife says like, I'll go, like we'll be at the grocery store and I'll have all 3 kids. And then she'll go to like go grab something. We'll be in line, right? And she'll be like, hey, I forgot this thing. I got to go get it. And then you'll have like in the span of 5 minutes, I'll have like 3 people make a comment and be like, oh, super dad, you got all these kids, you know, and then I'll come back and I'll tell her and she's like, no one ever says that to me.
No, super mom. It's like, and your kids can throw fits and do all sorts of stuff. But it's a pretty remarkable thing. I mean, kids kind of expand your ability to love is the way I describe it.
Yeah.
It's a testament to everybody should have kids in life. It's one of the things that is a blessing.
So real quick on the retirement thing comment. So what was just the drive? Was it just truly to spend time with the family and you felt like this was something that, because I'm kind of envious of that, that you even like were in that headspace to be able to want to do that. Because I think COVID was the closest I've been in my career to being home all the time. And we were really fortunate in a lot of ways because we had a third child and right in March 17th. So it was like right when all this hit of last year. And then I got to spend basically a year working from the house, but being here all the time. And I felt like that was a really cool thing because most people, you know, before that, was in work all the time. My other 2 kids, you maybe take a week off and then you're back at it. So how was it? How'd you get to that point? And that's just, I'm envious. I don't know where you're at, but that sounds like a really cool.
Yeah. So, at TPH, we'd grown considerably. And so, and the value had gone up a lot as well. And so financially, it was a good opportunity and a good opportune time for an exit.
Yeah.
And then secondarily, like I'd kind of done everything that I thought I could do in that business.
Right.
Like I was running the upstream team. Like it's pretty dominant upstream research business still today. I didn't really want to go into banking. The private equity side wasn't really that big. Asset management as well, and kind of just needed some time off.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting in life. I've seen that like about 7-year increments, I tend to do something different. And so was at Shell for 7 years, was then, with South Coast for 5, was with Pickering for 7, and now I'm 8 years into Heikkinen Energy Advisors, and we're merging our business back with Pickering Energy Partners and Sailing Stone Capital.
So that's big news, though, right? Like
I mean, this isn't. It'll be something that's been in the works for a long time, and kind of getting back together, really with a focus on how you make good investments,
right?
Both on the public and the private side, and we'll continue to provide a subscription model for our research. And the thing that's critical about the way we thought about the combination is, we've always been oil and gas folks, but talking about the technology that was developed for shale and shale oil, like really what we think the next 10 and 20 years are going to be, it's really technology, energy, and mobility. And so when you think about, in 1998, there wasn't a technology, media, telecom sector. It didn't exist. And really became the growth industry of the last 20 years. Really, I think technology, energy, and mobility is really the growth industry of the next 20 years. And it's going to be the ways that we make and power the world most efficiently, and the best carbon method is really what our focus is. And so they've got a larger team, a larger presence, can make investments directly in the public and the private side, and we can continue to advise and consult with institutions and companies as far as they try to think through the way to actually manage the next evolution of the cycle. And it really isn't just a cycle, it's really a growth business. And the thing that is going to be so important is the energy transition, as people use that word probably a little too much,
right?
But the multiples of capital they're going to be put into, like Ford's announcement of $30 billion of EV spending, like it's probably 8-fold, maybe kind of the size of the annual investment to make the energy transition work, to move down the carbon chain, to figure out ways to sequester incremental carbon, to find ways to take natural gas and split it into, blue hydrogen and sequester the carbon, to continue to, pull oil and natural gas out of the ground in the lowest carbon way, and have solar and wind that have just really emerged as very economic ways to really power and generate electricity. It's probably the coolest thing that I can see on the horizon, and probably the biggest growth sector out there.
Yeah, that's awesome. So how long, I mean, a little bit on the merger. So it's basically taking the two firms and putting them back together. You guys think you're going to be doing similar strategies, or with this merger, it's going to take you down like these other avenues with the ESG and the energy transition? Is that part of the motivation? Is the motivation just, 1 + 1 = 3? I mean, what are some of the synergies and reasons behind it, and what are the goals with doing it? I mean, I know you went into some of it there, but
yeah. So probably taking a step back. So Heikkinen Energy Advisors is effectively a consulting business on the sell side for institutional investors. And there's only so many hours in the day that you can bill yourself for.
Sure.
And so the way you can have compounded value adds is by putting capital to work. And then, being close to people and advising people that are putting capital to work is important as well. But really, I think that's the key, is on the private asset side, on the public asset side, being in a position to continue to deploy capital into the legacy oil and gas sector and keep that knowledge base up, and help people understand where and how you can make other investments along the rest of the energy value chain. That's really what we're going to be able to do. And to be candid, just doing it on our own as Heikkinen Energy Advisors, we're just a small firm, and so like the larger platform, I think, can have more global scope and global reach, and we have pretty big aspirations, I think, as far as where we're going to take this over time. And if you think about what Tudor Pickering Holt was at the peak whenever I left, I think we were about 13. Energy was about 13% of the S&P 500. Right now, if you think about technology, energy, and mobility, you can really cast a light across 20% of the existing S&P 500, even with the low weight that energy is currently. And then if you start expanding that, really the breadth of what the investment opportunity is really does become multiples of anything that we've tried to tackle before.
Sure. Yeah, that's exciting. Well, it's cool that you guys are doing that, and I just think the space on the research side and some of the consulting stuff is really interesting. But what I like about it a lot, and what I'm kind of jealous when I see the work that you guys put out, is it just the topical nature of always having your finger on the pulse of virtually everything that's going on. I mean, I get your daily stuff. I get TPH's stuff too, and it's really good. It's like just a great snapshot for me to be like, look, what's happening right now. And you'll do different highlights where you'll highlight EMP, or you'll highlight OFS or midstream or whatever. And so you've got this level of business intelligence that you guys have aggregated and focused on being experts in it. And then I think that how does that parlay into like these investment opportunities and ways to deploy capital and to do things like that? I think it's probably pretty powerful. I mean, at least intuitively to me, it seems like it would be.
No, I mean, I got really lucky to find a job where I just get paid to sit around and think. And I have a pretty broad, I could talk to you across the carbon chain, and probably the biggest market that's going to emerge is going to be around carbon, to, spending some of my COVID time to diversifying away from, and trying to find inflation hedges around gold and the minerals, and then even crypto, which has been a wild ride for a lot of people, but I actually think it is a legitimate inflation hedge, particularly on the Ethereum side. As you kind of think about Internet 3.0, and really moving markets onto the blockchain as a whole. I just think that there's a more efficient way to do things, and some of the energy markets and trading actually should move in that direction as well, which is why I think the legacy brokerage and banking business just is going to be flawed for like my generation and my kids' generation. There's just a more efficient way to actually execute transactions on a distributed ledger. And so we just said that trading isn't going to be something that's meaningful. And so we really did decide like we need to be on a subscription-based system where we really do, you're a content creator, we can understand what the value is, we know what people want. And then we just get to, kind of think through what is important as a whole. And so the thing that we were blessed with the shale revolution is there's a tremendous amount of capital going in, and nobody knew how horizontal wells worked, fracking worked. like what was going to happen, how these companies, what basin was going to get tested next. I mean, you lived it on the midstream side of like, there were all sorts of new plays and new concepts being tested. And we were there trying to help people understand and translate, what exactly was happening.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I'm going to tilt this a little bit just towards you that way. I think that's good.
Sorry, 1 sec on the...
No, you're fine.
But I mean, the thing that we got, and the other factor that I love doing, and I'm talking a lot on this, is like we get to tell stories. And so we get access to management and ideas. And so that's probably the first differentiator of what we do. And being able to sit down, I still remember in 2000, it's a long 21 years ago. So I was 28, 29, and was sitting down with the CEOs and CFOs of all these companies who have clawed to get to their position, of the best people in their organizations.
Right.
And I could just sit down and ask them any question I wanted, and they would spend the time with me to try to help me understand what they were trying to do. And so you get access first to really smart people. And my grandpa taught me one thing, which was every person you meet has something inside them that's better than you.
Yeah.
And so then you're around, this is kind of like the 5 people you associate with analogy of like, you're the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Yeah.
And you just take the best from them. So you get access to really good people. And then you just start thinking about what that story is. Like, what's going to be the theme? Where is that going to go? And you can weave, people into it. You can weave assets into it. And that's what the daily habit of the daily note is, or a weekly note is. You're just in this process of, getting people's mind share every day or every week. And they're listening and kind of understanding how you think about things, and they get used to the way you tell your stories.
Right.
And then, like, if you get to that point, you've now defined the narrative, and like the word narrative has come out a lot recently.
Yeah.
But it really is like how you write a good story is like the narrative of the space. And unfortunately, the oil and gas sector lost the narrative, which was, we've got too much methane emissions, like too much carbon, and like the reality is like if natural gas is a bridge fuel to hydrogen for sure, carbon capture is a bridge, and it's the industry that can deploy $1 billion of capital in offshore projects very effectively. Yeah. Why can't it be the leader in offshore wind as a whole? I mean, it just makes sense. And that the problem is the space just got put on the wrong side. Like, I say this a lot. I don't see very many oil and gas executives flipping the bird to environmentalists or energy transition people, but I see a lot of energy transition people flipping the bird back at oil and gas folks. Yeah. And that's just not a conducive environment to make change happen. Right. And that's where that conflict comes. And that the best stories have conflict.
Yeah.
And like, so now I get this opportunity to sit around and think. I get access to super smart people on both sides. There's a theme and a story that's coming. There's a bunch of money being deployed, and we saw with shale that you can destroy a ton of capital. Yeah. Unfortunately, in the energy transition, you could destroy multiples of it.
Yeah,
and then you have conflict, and so like what's a better thing to be able to spend your time thinking and talking about than a great story?
Yeah, you hit on a bunch of things I want to talk about. I love that you already are like a content creator, not like a content creator. You are a content creator. It's mostly in the form of notes, and you have a newsletter that goes out, which is really powerful, to your point around just getting in people's feed. And that's the OG feed, which is your email. Mm-hmm. Before it was the scroll, really. It's just the static. You get them in, they come in every morning, and it's the first thing you look at. And then that's a way to get your thoughts and ideas into the world. And when we first started talking, it was kind of around content. And I think you need to do more. I think this is good kind of content to people to hear your voice. And I've been bugging you to do more. I'm like, hey, we should do more content. I think it would be really positive for you to message into things that you're trying to get out. And so, and you've already been doing it. Like, you're pioneering it, but just in a different medium. And now that like technology is easier, you can get cheap camera equipment relatively, right, to what it was 20 years ago. I mean, to get the cameras and the podcast equipment, it's really not that expensive, and you can put the thoughts out there. And then the other thing you said was talking about meeting with these people, these CEOs. And it reminds me a lot of like part of the thesis of why I wanted to do the podcast was just have conversations with people. And I knew intuitively that getting in front of somebody was like if you could just like get in front of somebody and share ideas and have a conversation, I knew in my career kind of intuitively that's where things happened, right? Like I knew that like, hey, if I went to NAPE or if I went to this dinner or if I did this thing, that odds are I'd have conversations with people. And then I knew that just from that, you didn't know how, like it wasn't always a straight line, but I knew that eventually that led to opportunities and to being able to do projects or get clients or do deals. And so that is it's a powerful thing. And so you've figured it out in the way that you've done the content and with the research stuff, getting access to all those people. It resonates very much with me, what you're saying around some of the thesis to, me having a service company, but then also trying to do the content creation as well.
No, I totally think you can get, and every conversation you had, you learned something.
Oh,
and so
absolutely.
Like the opportunity, and I talk about this a lot of, the legacy modalities of communication have changed completely, as have the legacy business models around it. Like, journalists are in a tough spot right now.
Yeah.
Who's going to the Edmond, Oklahoma city council meeting and writing a report about it? Like, and if you don't have the fourth state out there, like you really have an issue, and we've kind of destroyed that, unfortunately. And the same thing around like the emergence of, podcasts, the emergence of Clubhouse, the modality of, FinTwit is powerful.
Yeah.
And I think that it's all about like touching people in slightly different ways, and then just delivering them the opportunity to have access to thinking and thoughts, and in whatever ways the easiest for them to consume.
Yeah.
And so, I'm a big proponent of kind of how and where things are going. And I do think that the, like live streaming on LinkedIn is something that's emerging. And I think over time, if you go back and you've got young kids, I've got young kids, they don't watch the news. Like they watch YouTube, and like they're not on social media by design. I'm not on social media other than Twitter. I see some flaws in conflict, and we're social animals that tend to emerge into clubs and teams and cliques. Unfortunately, the social media is kind of exacerbating those cliques and followings.
Yeah.
But we are still social. And so like the thing that people underestimate is, COVID taught us one thing, is we can do things remotely.
Yeah.
And can be effective in a short period of time. But it also taught us that we need to have the one-on-one face-to-face time with people to really know where they're coming from and what they're thinking about. And watching people, it's unique. Like TV and movies are so great because you're effectively able to participate in a conversation or see what's happening with none of the downside, and they'll never know what you're actually thinking or doing.
Yeah.
And that's what these are. That's what a podcast is. That's what a video is on YouTube or Vimeo. Those ways of getting things out to people, like it's kind of human nature of wanting to figure out and have the access to consume it.
And it humanizes. I mean, I think like for me, when I first was on the fence about, and I've said this before on the podcast, I was very on the fence. I really wasn't. I mean, I just started like a Twitter not that long ago, and it's mostly just low effort, bad memes. But thought I had to be there because I was like watching it for a while. Like, I had like just like a account with no followers or a really old one, and I was like, I should probably just have a public account and be engaged at least kind of in that space. And then on LinkedIn, I didn't even have like a picture, and I was like, all right, I should probably get like a headshot done. I haven't had a picture since 2010 for work. I was like, I probably need to, it's been a decade. I probably need to get like photos taken and just get myself out there. And then the podcast, it was like where I got comfortable with it was I was listening to other people's, and then I would have a conversation with that person, and I was like, I feel like I kind of know this person, or I've like touched, it's like almost like I've learned about them in a way and connected with them that it just felt powerful to me. And so that was kind of some of the driver. And then to your point around just being a fly on the wall, and it's like you had those conversations with those CEOs when you're 28, 29, and even to today. And it's like some of those, if they were podcasts, I'm sure would have been just fantastic. You capture that moment. I mean, they maybe not have been the same conversation because they know they were being recorded, but at the end of the day, it probably would have been somewhat the same, and you could have had a really powerful history of that moment and that you could share with others. And so there's just something there that you add all that together, and then you put the technology of leverage, or the leverage of technology on it, and it's super powerful.
The thing I got blessed with when I went to South Coast Capital is there were 15 to 20 salespeople that had networks that were out there wanting to
Right.
talk to their investors about whoever was generating the best ideas. And I sat on the sales floor. I was at the worst seat probably in the organization as an associate. But we had a gaming analyst, we had a retail analyst, we had a technology, really a telecommunications analyst. And I could go into the morning meeting and see, like, what did they say?
Yeah.
What story did they tell? And then what did the sales team react to, and then go immediately out and make calls to people? And so they had this network effect of like 1 goes to 15,
right,
that then goes to 10 to 20 to 30 calls a day. And that was just like, that is the power of what a legacy sales force was. What's really changed is now we have exponential networks. Like
right.
I've talked to people that are older than me that always said your Outlook contact list is essentially your business genetics.
Right.
Like it's the summary of like overlap with us. We knew one person that overlapped us. But like now, like a morning note can get forwarded to a lot of people, and people know my name that I don't have any idea who they are. But just imagine like the network effects of like what the big podcasts have done, or
it's crazy.
The media that's being created. That there's people that could listen to this that have never heard of either of us, and might like what we say. And so there's these great investment opportunities. That's the thing that I think is most compelling. But then you've got this modality of telling great stories with networks that are exponential, and like the way that this can grow is super compelling.
Yeah. Well, I think the one thing that's really shocked me about it is not the views. It's been the, and you don't get this on the audio. I wish you did, but on the video and on the LinkedIn, they give you hours listened. And so I'll upload like a 2-minute clip to LinkedIn that's just like a snippet of something that we had in one of these conversations. And I'll be like, wow, this one really did good. It's got like a couple thousand views. I'm like, that's crazy. And because like on YouTube, it may only get 100 views. But LinkedIn, I've got a bigger network and it's more professional based, and people, I think, gravitate towards professional content. But then where it really gets kind of shocking is you'll click on that and it'll be like 50 hours of listening time or something, and you're like, what? 50 hours? That means everybody watched basically the full 2-minute clip, and it just is kind of staggering. It's like, where else could you get 50 hours of exposure to anything? I mean, like, it's just kind of mind-boggling.
I don't need to get into the big brotherism of how we can see what people do, because we don't use it from that standpoint. But remember Sam Harris, guy I listened to,
I know Sam.
Meditate with him. I've been doing it for a long time. But he talked about writing books versus his podcasts. And like, a book that gets 1 million sales is like an incredibly successful book, and the amount of time and energy it takes. And
so
he's like,
much.
You can get, multiples of that with one podcast that just gets out to so many people, and immediately. It's not, that's the immediacy of it that is so interesting. And that's really where Twitter even comes in. And really Dan Pickering has done a really good job of promoting his brand and the firm's brand, and I'm really hopeful that like we'll continue that, because I think that mode of getting out to more people is going to be important, because that's what's going to allow us to bridge the gap to the people who are flipping us the bird on the energy transition side, on the legacy oil and gas side, and vice versa. Like you got to have communication, or you can't do anything. There's 2 ways to solve a problem. You can talk or you can fight. And if you don't know how to talk, you're going to fight. And that's just the reality.
That is. Let's talk about that, the comment, because that was earlier when you talked for a while. Those are a couple of the things I wanted to break down. And so on that point around one side being kind of hostile and the other side maybe being less, although there's plenty of hostile oil and gas people if you look on LinkedIn or whatever. It goes both ways. But I do think that there's this element of, it's almost like both sides are kind of talking their book a little bit, right? It's like there's a financial incentive for this group over here, whether that's oil and gas people, whether that's renewables people, to bash or to promote stories or headlines or things that kind of tear down the other group because, hey, I'm selling solar panels, or I'm doing these, whatever, this energy transition themed business. And then, and by the way, I'm trying to take your business over here. So I'm going to say, I'm going to promote this narrative that's really negative to you. And then these other people are saying, well, you're trying to take my business, so I'm going to fight back on that. And it's not really all that productive. And I also am like one of those, for me, it's kind of like, if you're out there and you're bashing on something, it's like, but you have a financial incentive. If that other person, I'm kind of like, it just feels a little icky. And so that's where sometimes I felt like with the renewable stuff, I'm like, or we could just talk about the pros and cons, because clearly energy is going to be a mix. Like it's just going to be. It's going to be a mix. And so this idea that it's absolutes, like, hey, this is the way to go and you're the wrong way. Well, it's like, nah, guess what? We're going to need petrochemicals, right? So you're going to need natural gas and oil. I mean, at some level, like it's not going away. So it's, how do we get more productive, I guess is where I'm coming at. How do we get more productive?
The conversations, I think every market has its own strengths and weaknesses. So like there's, the Danish oil and natural gas company, Dong, became Ørsted, which is now a large offshore wind company because the North Sea had plenty of wind capacity. The Chinese market, where you have a lot of space, they're dominant in solar and batteries. We're blessed in Oklahoma and Texas with a whole lot of wind. And that's a blessing, and we're also blessed with a whole lot of natural gas. And so like I think each market, there's just this question of what's going to be the most effective method to close the gap. But in reality, like the problem that I worry about most is, whether or not it's climate change or if it's the economics of putting in a bad solar or wind or natural gas or keeping an uneconomic coal plant running. The poorest of the people actually are the ones that are hurt the most. Because at some point an uneconomic wind or solar project is going to roll into someone's rate case, and that's going to flow down to the utility bill for whoever that electricity is going to.
Right.
And for the wealthiest of people, like I there was a time in my life where I ran out of gas because I didn't have any money in my pocket. And the thing that is so difficult is the people don't understand that the poorest and the most vulnerable are the ones that are going to be most impacted by bad economic decisions or by continuing to see climate move in the wrong direction. Because you'll see, food production costs will go up. You'll have the lowest lying areas, typically are some of the poorest neighborhoods that flood in Houston already, where I live now, or in New Orleans. The high ground is where the more expensive stuff was whenever New Orleans was founded. And like, uptown on the ridge didn't flood through Katrina, but my house in Lakeview did. And so like the reality is like, if we don't do this better and work together across the aisle and across the sectors, the weakest among us are the ones that are going to suffer from bad projects, bad economics, or really a lack of a change. And that's what I think our network and our platform has to stand for. It really is, I think, the benefit of getting this message out broadly and across sectors, beyond just oil and gas, beyond just energy transition. I think it's really what the policy needs to be. And we have a movement where there's going to be a tremendous amount of investment made as we try to restart the economy post-COVID globally. And so like, it's the perfect opportunity to expand and try to help make this the most efficient and economic way to make this transition, and also like really lift up the world. Because I think that's the thing that people don't understand. And I know, I can disagree with some of the moral case for fossil fuels rhetoric, but there are 800 million people in sub-Saharan Africa that still don't have access to reliable electricity or any electricity. And if we could wave a magic wand, we wouldn't have installed all the phone lines across the nation that we did, because you can do this all wirelessly now. Well, let's take the lessons of, if we were going to design an economy today with the intelligence of the technology sector, the morals of the left and the right, and like really try to figure out how we're going to lift the poorest of us up. And I think that's where we're going to go. It's
for sure. And so for me, like I try to not be, I go through these like up and down periods where sometimes I'm like really optimistic, and I look at, and really it's been the last year probably that I've really had to kind of get myself to a place where I'm being more open-minded about the energy transition, because there's times too when I can get like really cynical, and you look at some things and you're like, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And one thing that I saw, like a comparison the other day, it was really interesting to me, and I don't know that I'm going to be able to make a good point from this, but it was at least thought provoking. And it was someone, basically talking about the last energy transition and like Rockefeller and what he was able to do. And it was the reason why he was the wealthiest man on the planet was because he was, increasing the quality of life for people, right? Like he brought kerosene, which was able to, people could light their homes. And he grew up where you didn't have light in the evenings and you couldn't read, you couldn't do these things. And not only was he bringing it, it was getting cheaper and cheaper. I think the price of kerosene dropped like 90% over from when he started to when he retired. And then also, gasoline in the automobile. And by the way, electric cars were older. They were about 15 years older than the combustion engine. Those were the it was a combustion engine was outside of the vehicle.
Yeah.
And then you got the they brought it inside the vehicle, and that was a huge innovation. And so they gravitated towards that technology because it made sense. You could carry the fuel with you. And so if you look at all these things that made him like the wealthiest man on the planet, and to this day, even like inflation adjusted, I think he's still the wealthiest person to ever lived. It's because he created all these products and services that bettered people's lives and that people used every day, became widely adopted. And then you look at and that's powerful. That was a huge energy transition. We went from this hydrocarbon age and the industrial age, and that's what brought us to where we are today. And if you look at like quality of life and any metric you want to look at, right? Like lifespan, cost of living, all these things have trended with the more hydrocarbons, the better humans have been, basically. And then you look at the modern kind of tycoons, and for the most part, they've all created a good or a service that has been widely adopted that's bettered everybody's lives. Like if you look at Larry Page, we all use Google, Bezos, we're all using, I got these bottles of water probably delivered from Amazon. Apple, we've got, Steve Jobs, everybody's got an iPhone in their pocket. And then the part and this was the part that was a little bit cynical about this article, it was actually a podcast, and it was like, but then you look at Elon Musk, who's also held the title of wealthiest man on the planet. And if you look at all of his other peers, like those guys I just listed, it was like the top 5 guys. Like he's the only one that hasn't created something that really is widespread or that's everybody's using it. It was like, I think EV is like 1 point something percent of the total cars. He's been doing it for 18 years. It's still really low adoption. The primary driver of the profits has been subsidies and all these different, these tax credits that he sells sells to people, right? And so the article was basically kind of dogging on Elon and being like, if you really want to be this Rockefeller type guy that's going to create all this catalyst and all this change, then you better start bettering people's lives and doing it in a way to where the energy transition actually lowers the cost for everybody to have all these things, creates innovation to make your life better and to do these things. And it was a negative article. It was a negative deal it was a podcast. It was negative on Elon. But it was kind of like a really interesting way to frame it for me. And I think that with the energy transition, it has to be something that actually is market competitive and that betters people's lives and that makes the technology better. Or I think it's going to just be kind of this tax credit subsidy thing that I don't think it can be totally supported like that forever. I mean, obviously it has to at some point be free market in my mind, but that's where I get a little bit cynical. I'm like, this has to at some point has to make people's lives better, right? Or it's just going to be hard to be sustained as like a long-term thing.
I mean, I've got a Rivian electric truck on order.
Yeah.
So and I don't know if you've driven a Tesla, but they're pretty freaking awesome. I mean, I used to have a Maserati, and a Tesla would lap it.
Yeah.
And so like he created a pretty cool product. And really the thing that I think is interesting, because I do think in terms of stories and narratives, and Elon Musk is somewhere closer to P.T. Barnum than Rockefeller. Like he tells a great story and created a little niche that people want to be associated with.
Right.
And he has this cool product that like changing the perspective of, vehicles as a service. Like autonomous is really the next step. Like my kids may not drive a car. They may not drive an internal combustion engine car. And I do think that is something that will better a lot of people's lives. And then I think
the autonomous certainly will, I think.
Then the digital evolution of a car, like I've got our pediatrician has had a Tesla since version 1. And, they get push updates that make the car better all the time, the same way you get an iPhone update.
Yeah.
And, that, can make it run better, can make it run faster. He doesn't go to ludicrous speed, but there is definitely a degree of, that was a change that, an ICE vehicle, nobody even thought of. And so I don't don't know if Elon's a good guy or a bad guy but I definitely think he tells good stories.
Yeah.
And then he convinced a lot of smart people to work with him.
Yeah.
Like he developed a vision and then told a good story, attracted capital, weathered through effectively near bankruptcy, built another company at the same time in SpaceX, attracted smart people,
Right.
took what we thought, which was NASA that was hugely inefficient, and now has the ability to, that's the more efficient way to actually put payloads into space. And so it's like the storyteller and the guy that with a vision is hard to discount.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I think people miss about him. And I'm not a huge Tesla fan. I mean, you can like companies and not like stocks, and I do that a lot. And so I don't like their stock at all. I think that over time, Ford, Volkswagen, Rivian, like there's a tremendous amount of competition that's coming. They're going to have to start advertising more. They've never had to advertise.
There's a ton of competition coming. I mean, I think.
No, and you're really, if you're trying to solve carbon, EV is a very, very small part of our total carbon emissions.
Yeah.
The benefit that EV does, though, is we can concentrate where, a gas-fired power plant is, and then we can sequester the carbon there. Right. It's hard to sequester carbon with all of us driving our own carbon emitters. Yeah. And so the benefit of EV is you have to bring, the renewable side or carbon sequestration to actually make it have an impact on the long-term goal. And I think a lot of people don't understand, when you plug something into the wall, no one associates that with, the 30% wind that is west of here, and the natural gas power plant and the coal power plants whenever you're actually plugging in your vehicle. And I always thought I'd credit the guys at Rice, they drive Teslas in Pittsburgh. And they always said it's the most Pennsylvanian of vehicles out there because it's 30% coal and 70% natural gas. Yeah. It's a heck of a lot more Pennsylvanian than an ICE vehicle because you don't really produce that much oil in Pennsylvania. Right. And like the way you get your power is kind of the important part. But I do think that having people that, bring without Tesla, Ford, Volkswagen, Porsche, like they wouldn't be making the investments they are now.
Right. He's a catalyst for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
but I do get like your cynicism, like I'm questioning, and I hear it from a lot of oil and gas folks of like this transition is just destroying value carbon isn't that big of a problem. And I'm just curious, when you talk to people up here, like what do you hear that is the biggest pushback around energy transition? Is it a fear of jobs? Is it? I mean, Oklahoma City
I'll tell you my personal pushback on it because I think everybody has their own. Because I try to be like logical and try to remove some emotion from it if you can. And I think for me, the biggest pushback is when I hear things like when I see these climate models or things that give you like a certain timeline, like, right? Like let's go off like JoeBiden.com, and I've talked about this before with one of my guys that was on. It said like we have 8 years, we have 9 years, it like really conveniently lined up with like a 2-term president, right? But he's like the models say that we've got this much time to make these many changes and we can get there and save the planet. And then you look at the proposals with whether it be EV or the renewables and all these things, and you talk to the smart people that can tell you like this is not going to get to where these models are saying, and all these policies are being based off of these timelines. And by the way, we can't get there with these other technologies. That doesn't mean in 20 or 30 years or however long when our kids or grandkids, that doesn't mean they won't be there then, but the messaging that's being used to push forward a lot of the policy and the decisions and the push for these technologies aren't going to get us there. And then you look at like what China's doing and the amount of coal that they're burning and all these things. And so I say, okay, we're not going to get to the solution that we want. Hey, here's a solution. Like what if we went to, using more nat gas or put anything that's like hydrocarbon based? I feel like that could maybe get to some of these goals that we want to get to. They're just like kind of flatly outright rejected or a lot of times pushed back on, like to your point earlier. It's like, nah, that's oil and gas related or that's natural gas related. And so that's where I get cynical is it's like, okay, well, we've set these goals. There's ways to get close to those or meet them, but you have to use a mix. You have to employ more natural gas or maybe do some of these things that aren't so renewables heavy. And then like when that's rejected and I'm like, well, then we're not going to get, I don't know. That's where I start to get cynical. It's like, let's actually get objective based decision making. And like, look at the current administration. It's like, look, okay, shut down Keystone Pipeline or stop fracking on federal lands. And I've said this again on the podcast for people that listen, so it's probably repeating it, but it's like, that's not really achieving the climate stuff that we like. I had a guest on that's a guy that's in California, and I don't know if you listened to that one, but he's like, we're importing our oil from these countries that have all these terrible regulations. And he's like, we have the cleanest oil field in the world right here. It's so clean. And by the way, we're going to need it anyways, but instead we got ships parked out here. So I think for me, when and they're emitting all this and it's, flooding into the city, the emissions. And so that's where I get cynical. It's like, let's be practical, objective-based solutions where it's like, here's the solution, it gets us to the objective, not here's the solution, and by the way, it doesn't really get us to that objective, but the objective is what we're, you know what I mean? It's like this. Yeah, so that's where I get.
I guess I'm going to ask a couple quick questions. I'm curious because you said that you're logical, and like that's where you kind of try to make decisions.
Try to think through the different game theory of Would
you say you're more of a person, like if you have the scales of justice, that you're putting weights on both sides, and like, does that just, whichever one tips a little bit more, that's the way that you would make the decision? Or are there any things in your life where it's like, you have one 10,000 pound weight and it's just one issue, and you just put it on one side, and you could have, everything else on the other side, but that 10,000 or whatever you put on this side, it will always outweigh whatever you put on the other side? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I would say, you mean like if...
Yeah, like is there one factor, like, I mean, I can take my Catholic legacy growing up, for a lot of my family, abortion is a 10,000 or a million pound or 10 million pound or an infinitely pounded weight that they make a lot of decisions around and vote around.
Yeah.
Are there, or do you think about an issue and then like, put all the little bits of it together?
I try to weigh it out, right? I try to weigh it out and see like what the different, I don't want to say, it's not because I work in hydrocarbons or because I have some grounded belief. Like, trust me, I'm trying to figure out ways to work in the energy transition. That's what I spent most of my time thinking about. It's not that I'm opposed to doing these things. I think where I get cynical is when I see that the things getting pushed forward and I'm like, these aren't meeting the goals. Like, why? That's where I get cynical. I'm like, this isn't getting us there. So, and it seems like some of it's just driven by the fact that, well, it's this technology over nat gas, so let's push that. And I'm like, yeah, but nat gas would be like, it could get us to a reduced carbon footprint quicker, which would hit these climate goals. And so that's where I start to get to be like,
I think that the thing that I was going to is there's a lot of people on the environmentalist side that see the legacy of the Macondos or the Valdezes or the flaring in the Bakken or the Permian. They fly over and it's like, man, what's going on down there? Those people are just dirty, nasty people, and they just say they don't look for any more facts
while they're flying over it. And
exactly. Right. No, exactly. But they're not. They have this one factor that they just that's their million.
That's their thing.
Weight.
It's exactly.
And so like people, this is the thing that I think, and I'm a big. I think Dalio's principles are actually really interesting.
That's a good book.
But I always thought it was interesting at Bridgewater, the thing that he, in the way they learned things was everybody makes decisions completely differently than you do. Right. And people are thinking through things totally differently. And that's where I think that the biggest question is like, whenever people have million pound weights on one side of the table, it's really hard to chip away at that.
Yeah.
And I do think that is where a lot of the environmental movement and a lot of the people, it is the most important thing to them. And I think we search for truth as people, and like we search for groups to associate with as social animals. And, a lot of the legacy religion has gone away, and, people aren't going to church as much here. And so they're searching for something else that they can rally around that is a greater good. And it just becomes that hydrocarbons are not a greater good. And there's no more thought put into it other than that statement. And they never actually get anyone like us to sit down and talk to because they think, we're the closest thing to the devil.
Yeah.
I joked once, I was in Norway with Anadarko, and we actually had some whale at a sushi restaurant. It's like that white whale that's harvested all over the place there. Never had whale before, but I was like, I'm the axis of environmental evil. I'm working for an investment bank, flew over with an oil and gas company on a private jet, and now I'm eating whale.
Right.
Like legitimately, that was about as bad as the axis of evil could be.
Right.
And the reality is like that joke is not going to go over for a lot of people that listen to this on the other side.
Yeah.
Like I can see the humor in it. Like I don't think anything about those things, but it is the reality of like I did benefit from the oil and gas sector.
Right.
I still think I will. I'm going to know oil and gas better than anybody else for the next 20 years is my hope. But I'm also going to know a lot about how we can aid in the transition, how we can capture a shit ton of carbon.
Right.
And probably the simplest thing that we can do as a sector is just embrace that as opposed to, resisting. And, I've said this, right now when we're recording this probably won't go out for a few weeks, but, Exxon's having their board vote today. And the reality is if you don't sit at the table with the energy transition, you're going to get served.
Yeah.
And you'll be eaten alive gradually until something like the Exxon vote happens. The oil and gas sector, the best thing we can do is produce oil and gas as efficiently as possible with no emissions.
Right.
And then figure out and help a few people sequester some carbon.
Sure.
You're not going to become a wind company.
Yeah.
You're not going to become a solar company.
Right.
You're going to produce oil and gas. If you're a midstream company, you still got to transport stuff.
Yeah.
Like at least you can maybe get into the hydrogen economy somewhat. But like the reality is like you're still going to be transporting a whole lot of hydrocarbons and chemicals. If you're an oil field services company, you should change your name to energy services. Like right now, that whole sector should just drop oil field.
Yeah.
And it's not that they're dropping the oil field, it's that they're embracing energy. And like there's a huge opportunity for, them to work, there's scientists inside Schlumberger, Halliburton, Exxon, EOG that are trying to figure out ways to do things more efficiently and make more money with it.
Right.
And it happens to be green.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't tell anybody.
Right.
It's a little bit green to put a solar panel on and power a compressor station with electricity and natural gas.
Yeah.
Or put it on the grid where there's plenty of wind in West Texas.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't say that you're still producing natural gas, but you're doing it with a panel that is almost all wind all day long. And then you put solar in as well as some backup, and then you have a gas-fired power, generator or cogen that you can put on and generate electricity as well, and then maybe even capture the carbon.
Sure.
Like there are some simple little things that this sector can stop fighting the ESG side and actually can be a leader and do it in more economic ways than anybody else. And that's what I'm going to spend my time on.
For sure. And I think that going into the future, they should figure out a way to be, and I say they, I mean the oil and gas industry should figure out a way to be at the forefront of it. Because to your point, if you're not at the table, you're not going to have a voice. And also I think that there should be a push for making sure that if we're doing these things, if we're putting in a solar panel, where is it being sourced? Is it being sourced responsibly? The ES and the G, like make sure that it's, it's the labor that's being used in China is the right kind of labor, that they're doing the right environmental things. And like, I think that part of it is for the oil and gas industry, they are under the microscope, right? And that is part of the narrative battle because you're so under the microscope. All those like events that you talked about, like the oil spills or the things that happen, the flaring, that's what sticks in people's minds. And I think that another part of a little bit of my cynicism has been sort of the pass that I feel like the renewables industry gets. And it's like they're not the same level of scrutiny in my mind that the oil and gas people are put under. And I think that is not a positive for anyone, right? I think that if your whole business model is like, I'm greener, then you should be held to much higher standards. Like if you're selling a medicine that says you cure something, then you should be graded on whether it's curing that thing or not, right? But if you're just selling a medicine that's saying that you're curing something and no one's checking to see whether it's actually curing that thing, that's where I'm like, okay, so I think if oil and gas embraces it, I think they can be part of that change to make sure that the things that are getting done are actually greener and that it's actually making a better impact on the environment. Because I think that like not many oil and gas people are like anti the environment. And most people are like, we want the environment to be a better place. No one's like sitting around being like, I hate the environment. Let's pollute. Let's go do these things that are bad for the planet.
I don't think that we think about it as much though on the oil and gas side. It's like I worked offshore and when we were completing wells, we flared a whole lot of gas to get an unloading, and that flare didn't always burn the condensate perfectly well.
Right.
I think there's definitely bad decisions have been made in the past because of pace in the U.S. shale business.
Certainly.
And got in front of your midstream companies or the gas gathering, and like pace was a problem, and it destroyed capital, and it was environmentally unfriendly. The slowdown of the new shale economy, like the fact that they're going to, total shareholder return is going to include dividends now, and return of cash, because the tail value of a commodity, oil and gas, has real risk.
Right.
And so like these companies need to learn and adopt that returning cash to shareholders right now is going to be the best way to go. NAVs, net asset values, still matter. You still buy assets on discounted cash flows. But the reality is part of that cash flow needs to get back to the investor. And you need to have the discipline that a dividend and a variable dividend model actually provides, where there's going to be confidence that you're not going to do what you did in the last cycle and deploy too much capital and destroy a lot of value. The problem that oil and gas has, it's like 7 out of the last 8 years, it's been the worst performing sector in the market.
Yeah.
Most of our clients are younger than 40. And so like if you got into younger than 35, and so essentially in their entire careers, they've never seen absolute money made across the energy sector.
Right.
Like this year's a little bit 2021, like we're best performing sector in the market, coming off a bottom, still, minuscule amount of the S&P 500. The reality is like the sector needs to get that cash back and convince investors that they're going to, get good returns, because the world is seeking, income and seeking returns today. And energy is probably the one sector that has the biggest opportunity, to have a big component of cash returns.
Yeah.
So that's where I think the other side is the sector's going through changes on the financial discipline. The sector's going through changes on environmental, social, and governance. It's generally, gone through extreme attrition when oil went negative a year ago. And if you're young, you've probably been fired. And if you haven't, you're worried you're going to be. And that's not
it's kind of a rite of passage almost in the oil and gas industry.
No, I mean, it's, taking a package or getting fired is something that, cyclical industry that we've been in, definitely happens. And, that's a tough place to attract really good talent.
Yeah.
And then if you're not environmentally or socially, or have good governance, if you enrich management and pay people more in multiples of what similar people are paid on the other side, like that's a tough thing for investors to swallow. And it's also, kind of calling my baby, which is the oil and gas sector, ugly.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is a degree of it's not as ugly as it used to be, and it's getting better, and the world's kind of missing it.
Yeah. Do you think so? Talking about the current industry, and we always seems to come back to commodity prices. So I try not to ask people like, what do we think about price? Because people always ask that with me with natural gas. We do natural gas marketing, and they ask me about it with oil too. And I'm just like, if I knew that, I would be on an island somewhere, much wealthier than I am. But I think I hear all this stuff around, for example, like peak oil demand and some of these things. You saw that thrown around a lot with COVID this last year. And to me, and I'll tell you my bias, is that I think that there will still continue to be a meaningful amount of oil demand, especially out of some of these emerging markets, and a lot of people that don't have cars yet or that want to be the same quality of life that we have in America. And so I don't think we're there in terms of the late innings yet. I think we're probably still got, I don't know. I've read some books and tried to game theory. There's a good book that I read, and I can't remember the title of it, but he kind of game theories out energy usage. And it's basically just like, you can run down like using, and this guy's like got a background in like physics, and he very logically thinks through this. And he's like, look, we can look and see where these paths are going to go. And his, to spoil the book, it's like he goes, it's nuclear at the end, but there's still centuries of hydrocarbons, and you have this renewables wedge that's in there. But he kind of argues that there's some physical limitations around some of these things, whether or not technology can solve that or not, but focus on the hydrocarbons. How much runway, when you guys look at some of these long-term projections on these investment theses, is oil demand going to keep growing? Is it going to plateau and just grow at a lower amount? Is it going to decline? Because you have to almost answer that question before you can forecast what's going to happen on U.S. onshore, right? Or just worldwide oil development, E&P development. So just your thoughts on that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Loaded question, but
Yeah, there's a whole lot there. The oil side, we're going to have demand growth, then it'll go flat, and then demand is going to decline in my life, assuming I live, the 30 years.
So what do you think about population growth during that time? Because that's to me, that's kind of like the other.
I think we're going to have a flattening of population growth as well.
Because you would have to almost to get to that flattening of demand, I think.
Well, I think that the other factor is like, there's, I kind of think broadly across, so when you brought up nuclear, I don't know, have you ever heard of the thorium reactor cycle?
Well, maybe a little bit.
Basically, we went down the uranium and plutonium reactive cycle, and there's a nuclear engineering program at Missouri-Rolla. And there's a reactor on campus, and there's a reactor at Mizzou as well, because we wanted to make a bunch of nuclear bombs. And so like the unfortunate reality of our nuclear industry is we have an industry that is built around a cycle that's the wrong cycle, and the world doesn't talk about it very much, but it is the reality. We don't need to make any more nuclear bombs. And so like let's invest in the thorium cycle, which actually stops cool and doesn't have all the waste and doesn't have the byproducts of plutonium that you can then have to make your bombs. So then that's the nuclear phase that no one wants to talk about. The second component is I think on hydrogen. So I think hydrogen, high heat processes, cement, steel needs carbon by definition. And how do you generate a lot of heat? Doesn't make sense to not burn something to make a whole lot of heat, just kind of basic thermodynamics. Converting heat into electricity and back into heat has a whole lot of loss. And so why do that? And so hydrogen makes sense. Green hydrogen, why take renewables that are going to be needed for the whole EV fleet and everything, or powering your house, or like why use that to make hydrogen whenever you can just take natural gas and split it and sequester the carbon. Blue hydrogen seems like a very natural course. And now you got a source for hydrogen that tends to be point sourced, tends to be near plants. Most hydrogen is consumed on the plant where it is. It's not transportable very easily. It's super light gas, smallest molecule element that we have. It's hard to compress, but it is a good store of energy and generates a lot of heat work. And so then the second question is, now if you're not generating heat, you have shaft work. And so that's the other main way of turning things, whether or not that's axles or engines or motors or turbines, boats. Effectively, there's a question of like, what's the most efficient way for shaft work? And, whenever something's light, so the reason that, personal vehicles work really well is you don't have a whole lot of weight that you're trying to move around. So electricity is the best way to do that. And now you get into like airlines, boats, and heavy freight trains. And that is a tough one. Like, it's tough to say that batteries are going to be the most efficient way. Probably fuel cells start fitting into that. Hydrogen fuel cells start, creating electricity because you can store hydrogen on a boat or on a train. And then convert it into electricity. Diesel electric is how most trains work. And so the diesel electric model is probably what'll happen. And so what I'm getting to is like, I just went through and ruled out a lot of the places that we burn stuff. You can find non-hydrocarbon ways to do that. And that's why you're going to go into the decline, even with population growth still happening. I don't think you need to be Malthusian in thinking. And so there is definitely a way to continue to see people get uplifted while seeing hydrocarbon demand decline in my lifetime.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know. It's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of infrastructure that's going to need to be built, I think, right? I mean, is that the positive for a midstream person? Or just an oil and gas person in general? There's going to be a lot of infrastructure that needs to happen.
I mean, I was told at Shell, the best place to be as an engineer is on projects where capital is being invested. And then, leaping from Shell to becoming an analyst, then I'm close to where the capital is being sourced. And now leaping from Heikkinen Energy Advisors to Pickering Energy Partners again, really the main components of that is capital deployment. And that's, now we're actually spending the money and investing the money.
Yeah.
And so like the opportunity for significant wealth creation and value creation is being in a position where you're deploying capital into really the most efficient and effective projects.
Yeah.
And so as a midstream person, you ought to embrace the opportunities to electrify everything that you have. If you're in an area with a whole lot of renewable energy, you ought to embrace transporting CO2 for carbon sequestration. You should embrace figuring out a way to, mix a little hydrogen in with your methane for transportation. And I think it's like up to 20% of pipeline stream can be hydrogen before it's separated out, because hydrogen doesn't transport very well on its own.
Right.
And so like the thing that I don't see on the energy and the oil and gas space is, on the edges and in the core, just embracing where these changes are, and then communicate what the project economics are when you make the decision to make an investment, or communicate what the project economics were when you decided that wasn't the best thing to do. And then we can have a discussion of like where value is created and destroyed. But if you're not actually evaluating these projects,
right,
you don't have any reason to talk. And that's what we do all day long. We evaluate projects and evaluate investments. And like, unless you're in the middle of it,
sure.
Like listen and talk to someone like us that can help you understand what is the best opportunity.
Right.
I see a lot of people on both sides not actually listening or evaluating, or they hear one factoid and that becomes their religion. And I think that, again, I just keep coming back to there's a wide distribution of ways that we're going to crack this nut. And it's locally driven. And I think for a midstream company, just evaluate, like put someone on your team to see if there is an opportunity to put in more electric compression or powering off the grid, or feeding back into the grid if there is ever a problem like what we had in Texas. Like there are going to be ways for the whole oil and gas business to benefit as this moves forward, as opposed to suffering, which seems to be the default mode of the way a lot of people think.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I think for people that to adapt and change is hard for people. I mean, it just is. I think being an entrepreneur, for me, it's a little different because you're constantly kind of trying to have to reinvent yourself. So, for example, wanting to go do typical gathering processing deals, 5-10 years ago, there was a huge market for that. Today, there's no volume growth anywhere, and you can't underwrite massive investments in time zero with no volume growth. The math doesn't work. And by the way, there's been a bunch of them that don't have volume in them. So that business model is very difficult. If you're a land guy and your model was to buy leases and then sell them for more than what you paid for, then that model is probably not working very good. And so there's people that'll dedicate decades of their life to things that the model just doesn't work at some point, right? So you have to evolve. I think that's hard for people.
Trauma and fear lead to the biggest changes in people's lives. If you're a landman, solar and wind has a whole lot of leasing.
Sure.
If you're a geologist, geothermal and carbon sequestration is going to have a need for you. If you're a midstreamer, like big projects that are going to be capitalized for either moving carbon or continuing to move hydrocarbons, they're going to be needed.
Yeah.
And it's going to be in new areas. And I say this a lot. It's not that the whole, even in the most aggressive dehydrocarboning of the world, it's still a 40 to 50 million barrel a day demand projection in 2050.
Right.
Like the reality is it's an industry half the size of what it is now, but it's still a very, very meaningful industry.
Yeah.
And you guys and gals in our sector are really good at deploying capital and doing big projects. And so, just start doing them and like start evaluating them, find your niche. If you're young, I'd probably say be a little less hydrocarbon and a little more transition, like you said you wanted to do. But, there's still going to be, a long career on the hydrocarbon side in itself.
So where are the returns? Like when you look at chasing the transition, what's the juiciest area to tackle in terms of where like returns are going to be? Because I think that's one thing we've struggled with is you look at a lot of projects like the carbon capture stuff, and it's like we can identify places all throughout the oil field. A lot of them are kind of quick win places, right? It's like, hey, here's an amine treater, or here's an area where we could maybe go sequester some or capture something here on a power gen deal. But it's like, to get the economics, they're just not there given where the carbon markets are at and where the credits are at, or a lot of them aren't there. And then you look at those special types of facilities. I mean, it's going to have to be new facilities for the most part. You can't really retrofit. I mean, if you're moving, it's corrosive and you have to have new facilities and expensive. So we've looked at some things. There's been a few things that we've looked at that I think there was some meat on the bone and it was a little juicy. And it's like, all right, there's something that's in the ESG or the transition vein that we liked. But your thoughts in general, without giving away the secret sauce, but just where's the returns to chase? What are the most exciting areas?
Yeah, so Levi Strauss sold and made more money off the gold rush than anybody else selling blue jeans. And, it's the old sell pickaxes as opposed to building mines might be the best opportunities. And that's where the technology side of the sector comes in.
Yeah.
And, we cover a company that makes wood pellets. Effectively, trees are a carbon cycle, and so burning a wood pellet is a carbon neutral event. The carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, and then a tree grows, and then you cut down the tree, and then you burn it. So it's a cycle. It just goes again and again. It's a neutral. As opposed to pulling natural gas out of the ground, that's adding carbon to the atmosphere. So that's a great little company. And, you can displace coal-fired power plants with wood pellets very easily. We cover a company that does solar panel inverters. 40% EBITDA business, technology that was developed, where the inverters on each one of the panels as opposed to one larger inverter that most utility scale projects do. Basically they've grown significantly and are going to continue to grow for a long period of time. I do think that finding areas of growth that then compounds is the opportunity. And I don't think it's in chasing the next wind power project. Like those returns seem to be degrading, and there's a ton of capital that's competing for those types of projects. But listening to BP, their thought process is it's going to be stable for 30 years. And so they'll still have the cyclicality of the oil and gas sector with a nice stable base of wind that gets a 8% unlevered return, maybe. But again, that's like a blend of the portfolio. You don't want only that. You still want some of the juice, and they just don't talk. Total doesn't talk about that much either. Exploring with Apache and Suriname doesn't come up a lot, but they're still doing it,
right?
And I think that's the thing that I think the whole energy sector as a whole. It's no longer just oil and gas or just oil field services. I think it really is energy. And then it's the technology around that is the place that you're going to have the best investments.
Don't you love whenever oil and gas people dog on the renewables and the returns, and you're like, guys, we look at the last decade of the returns of the oil and gas. They're like, well, full cycle, the renewables, if you factor in this, and this, I'm like, well, full cycle of paying X amount per acre for leasing it and all the G&A, and it's just kind of like...
No, Arjun Murthy, who's on the board of Conoco, Goldman Sachs analyst, super smart guy, has gotten more active on Twitter recently. And I think he's talked about like the peak of the oil and gas business was 2006 when return on capital peaked. I think you could probably make that argument. And, because of the amount of capital that was deployed, like you said, leasing at $80,000 an acre. It's just hard if you think every well you're burdening it with, $6, $7, $8 million of cost per well, whenever the well cost $5, $6, $7, $8 million up front. Even the Pioneer double point deal that they just did, it's just hard. They added 1,000, 1,200 locations in their core, so huge industrial logic for consolidating. But like if you break up the parts, you're putting a couple $2-3 million of upfront cost to buy those locations when you already had 13,000, 14,000 already. And so it's like you're not going to drill all those up front. So it's while the industrial logic of consolidation makes sense, you still have to get into what's the economics of the investment decision. And then there's some of it like, I think that we'll end up in the U.S. with, kind of two main producers in each basin over time. And that consolidation, like what we saw from 97 to 2001, I think is going to happen from, 2000 and, call it 2020 through 2023, 24, where, you'll end up with a Continental and an Enerplus, essentially in the Bakken. You'll have EQT and someone else in Appalachia. You'll have a couple companies in Oklahoma, most likely. Oventive seems to have a commitment. Devon seems to have a commitment here. You'll have a handful of companies in the Delaware, probably 2 or 3 companies in the Midland Basin. And that's how you get industrial logic. And the thing that's so interesting is in our sector, for some reason, the consolidation and then the rationing of capital once you do a combination is what should happen. Cimarex and Cabot coming together, not a good deal for Cimarex, but they probably could have talked more about their not just G&A synergies, but operational synergies.
Right.
And there's got to be a degree of how they allocate capital synergies. 1 + 1 on their capital budget should equal 1.5. And then they should say, we're going to not put as much money into the Cana or into Cabot's Marcellus. We're going to slow those down, and our total budget will be less. And I bet that their net asset value might go up.
Yeah.
Because doing a little bit less and returning the cash sooner is probably a better model.
Yeah.
But people don't think, the legacy old guys, and I'm one of the old guys-ish, I'm on the fringe, are still struggling with how to really embrace this return model.
Yeah.
How does the midstream sector think about it? You're not seeing huge dividend increases. The MLP model kind of broke. Everybody went C Corp. I'm just curious, as you think about that consolidation of the midstream, what happens there?
Well, it makes sense for consolidation. I mean, you got a lot of fractionalized companies in these basins. And then I think that midstream, the bigger guys, they're probably not going to, I don't think they're going to divest many of these legacy assets. They're not giving them the TLC that they need. And there's, I think, a lot of lost, I know there's a lot of lost economic value in some of these big companies, these big midstreams, because I've seen it. I've seen that, I won't pick on people right now, but I've seen groups give away.
On.
Well, I've seen, for example, if you look at some of these legacy guys, we'll pick on a DCP or even a Kinder or a ETC, and you look at, they have the best acreage dedications, world-class resources, and they're just not, they don't develop them, and they'll release guys because they don't want to spend $3 million on a compressor station because they're scared to put the capital to work. And then you see a private equity midstream come in or in the last decade, and then they create a $2-3 billion company right on top of these companies. And then, those guys end up making, getting all this product. And then it's if you look at some of these groups, like a Targa or somebody, it's your strategy is NGLs and you're not chasing this stuff. How are you they're better than others. Targa actually does a decent job. But I've seen a lot of just value destruction with these larger guys, and it's this attitude of, well, we're not going to sell these old assets because we like the cash flow, and it makes sense. They're set up to milk that cash flow, and a lot of it's low decline in these legacy basins. But at the same time, you're not going to go connect a well because you don't want to spend a couple $100,000 because you're scared about your P&L for that one little system because, whatever. So it's just, I've seen a lot of guys, they should probably spin off the G&P to more aggressive, nimble companies that can capitalize on the growth opportunities and go after it. And then they should retain the downstream assets and continue to have that highway and make a lot of money there. But they ultimately just seem to not be able to get out of their own way on the G&P side. And it's risky too. Don't get me wrong. These G&P projects you got to spend money and hope for volume, and the producers are, they don't want to give you any commitments. So I'm not saying it's the easiest business in the world. It's hard, but we'll see into the future. I think there's gonna be more consolidation. There's a lot of private guys that need to be consolidated. I don't know when that's gonna happen. There's gonna be a lot of mark to markets there.
The thing that's interesting, and this is in the public markets, and I'm sure it's in the private market too, watching management teams, to become a CEO of a company, either founding one or ascending in one, takes a lot of sacrifice. And the entrepreneurs of the world and the people who have gotten into the C-suite, I think whenever you're striving for that, there's a lot of an expectation or a hope that you'll get to the point where maybe you could create some generational wealth. Yeah. And the fact that our sector's been so poor a performing sector, these guys and gals got to those positions, And now it just feels like they're hanging on. Like they just want, like, just give me another year of my salary, and let me get another bit of options awarded, or give me 2 years.
Well, some of them structure like that.
Like
I worked at, I'll pick on Williams because I've said this, I think, publicly before, but they're like very much like, when I worked there, I was just an intern there. I worked there early in my career, but it was kind of like, hey, I want to be in the commercial group. They're like, oh yeah, after 20 years, you can apply. And then you can get, and it was like, wait, after 20, and then I went to like a company like Chesapeake, and they're like, yeah, throw you in the fire. Here's 25 rigs. Go like build all the midstream for this. And you're like, wait, well, but then you look at some of these people at these older, these companies, and everybody that was hungry is kind of left. And then you got a lot of people that just sort of towed the line and just were there and put the clock in for 20 plus years, and they're just still kind of there. And so then where are the incentives? The incentives are just to kind of status quo.
Yeah. You just don't see consolidation, and like the private companies that you said wanted to sell, at least there's private equity smash cos that are happening left and right, just to try to, so the private equity guys can make all the money. I mean, not trying to be too harsh, but like, the amount of wealth transfer, to larger corporations from individuals and smaller companies, and through COVID has been probably one of the biggest disappointments. And so there's a whole lot of ability to point fingers at rich folks. The reality is like there's a degree of holding on. And I see it amongst my peers. There's like 36 analysts that cover Diamondback, and there's 25 that cover Ford, and like there's 24 that cover Enphase, the best solar company that's out there, that inverter company. And it's like, it's ludicrous that you're not seeing people consolidating out of this sector. And it's just interesting, like the same thing's happening with the C-suites. Like I think some of these management teams just don't want to give up the gravy train that they've had, and that governance in the sector, if we don't see consolidation, is gonna be because of a lot of social issues on boards and management, of 1 + 1 might equal lower capital spending, more free cash, and higher shareholder returns, but it means half the people lose their job, and they don't want to. I'm with our merger, I'm happily giving up control of my business to join what I think will be a better business. I think that there's going to be a bigger opportunity over time. We'll see how things go. If we can make a go of it around technology and trying to help people understand the transition, while continuing to help them understand the oil and gas sector, and be a reasonable voice that hopefully the people who listen to this and watch this will say we were reasonable. Yeah, I think you were pretty reasonable. I think I was relatively reasonable.
Yeah, I think so.
There's a way to convince people gradually, and conversation is the only way to make that happen, other than punching people in the nose. And punching people in the nose, while good exercise, isn't necessarily the healthiest thing to do.
Well, I'm glad that we did this, and I'm running out of time, unfortunately, but let's do something again. We've been kicking around the idea of doing more content, and I want to.
We should get on and do a live conversation. We'll pick a topic. You take one side, I take the other, and
or we just you can just talk about it, right? Exactly. Like we don't have to take both sides. I think pundits, they kind of have to, right? Like it's sports talk shows. It's like the one guy to the side he's taking, you're like, this is a ridiculous take, but it's like his job to be like, I'm going to fight on this.
We'll find some things we disagree about.
I'm going to fight on this take.
Then I'll convince you that I'm right.
Yeah, so there you go. There you go. All right. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.